Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening if you happen to be watching from Israel or someplace else in the world that's in that time zone. Uh, Here we are again, a week later for our chat with Ori Unterman. Ori was one of the original shinshinim at Bet Tzedek with the Toronto Shinshinim program that's been going on for several years now. And it's really a pleasure, Ori, to be able to catch up with you and see what's happening in Israel. And I think it's important for people, we got to humanize this conflict a little bit and take it out of the headlines and anxiety that people have when they watch the news about it. After last week's conversation, Ori, you sent me an email. We were talking about, of course, the conflation that happened with Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews and the mobs that were attacking each other. And you sent me an email afterwards about both an event that gave us cause for optimism and an event that of course sunk our hearts as well. Why don't we start with the optimism? You were sharing something that happened outside of your parents' apartment last week.
Of course. So first of all, I want to thank you again for the stage and for having me and being part of Bet Tzedek, of the community, especially at days like those. So 2 hours before we spoke last week, there was a beautiful rally happening right in front of my parents' place. They live in a small neighborhood in Jerusalem, right next to Mount Scopus. And there was a peace protest that was ran by Jews and Arabs who live around the area. And they were basically holding signs and saying things like, we live here together, we want to continue living here together. And I heard about both Jewish and Arabs, people who were driving next to the rally and got out of their car and hugged and decided to join the rally. Because we do have this reality, we do live in it, and we know that we'll have to continue living like this, even in a month from today. So this is something that gave me, as you said, it's kind of a feeling of hope, that not everything is negative, and that some people are interested in just living here in this area. And 9 hours after our conversation, exactly down the same street, my mother was awake at 2:30 a.m. and she heard screaming from the window. So she went out and she saw how down the exact same street that 3 hours before they had the peace protest, there were Arabs mobs who were smashing more than 10 cars down the same street. And one of them was my father's car. And they saw how people just coming with major blocks, like the size of my head, just smashing the windows, just want to destroy everything around them. They were actually coming in the two major roads that were blocked because they were blocked by about 40 cars from the Arab village that is just next to my parents' apartment. So the police physically couldn't come with the cars. My parents did call the police did come and started to chase them. And for me, it's heartbreaking, the fact that it happened exactly at the very same spot where the peace protest happened, just less than 12 hours apart.
Have there been more rallies of Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews coming together to send that? And do you think there's enough of that happening to drown out the other kind of noise at this moment, or is it still kind of unfortunately balanced between those that are saying, we have to find a way to live together and coexistence, and those that are angry and turning to the streets right now?
So there are actually a lot of small protests like this, whether it's, again, people standing together or people going to different neighborhoods than theirs and giving out flowers and just talking to random people. Those things do happen. I don't know in terms of numbers, but it is definitely a voice that is being heard around Israel. At the same time, I have to say that the riots, the violent riots, the vandalism acts around Israel from both sides are slowly coming down. So we do see those things are kind of like, again, going down a little bit.
Right. And what's your sense of the political and religious leadership of Israel? Have they been sending the message of pull back, stop this anger is not the way to deal with it? Have those messages been coming across?
If you ask me, not strongly enough as they should be sent. And I also don't think that they came quickly enough as they should have. For the past, I would say for the past week, things are starting again to calm down. And I think that a lot of it is because now the police know what's happening. So it's easier to deal with, but not everywhere. The streets of Jaffa were burning last week. That was horrible. We hear stories about neighbors being targeted by their own neighbors. So I don't think the leadership is dealing with it strongly enough.
And you're in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has not really had any sirens going off. There haven't been more rocket attacks on Jerusalem, really. I mean, that's been kind of quiet.
So thanks God, no. We haven't had any more sirens since the first one that we had about 10 days ago on a Jerusalem day, on a Yom Yerushalayim. But I will say that on a Shabbat, I went for a Shabbat walk afternoon, and I heard very distant booms. And after Shabbat, I read the news, and I figured that I heard bombs that were falling around the area of Tel Aviv. So during Shabbat, when everything is quiet, we do hear some of those things happening in the central part of Israel, but Jerusalem is relatively quiet.
And what are you hearing from your family and friends that are in the center and the south? I mean, Beersheba, Ashkelon, Tel Aviv. What are you hearing from people? How are they coping with what's going on?
At this point, the best way is to laugh about it. So people are writing in Facebook, "Oh, Hamas, please tell us, when are you planning on shooting the rockets this time so we know when to take a shower?" And things like that. People haven't been sleeping properly for a week. It sounds silly, but it is challenging, the fact that you're going to sleep in clothing that you know that you're going to see your neighbors wearing in a couple of hours, and you know that you're going to be woken up by the sirens. My fiance's grandparents live in Ashdod, and they don't have a shelter in their own apartment. They have one on the floor, and they're elderly. And I was talking to them this week, and they told me that they're just constantly walking back and forth from the shelter to the apartment. They don't really leave their building because they don't feel safe. If something will happen in the street, they won't be able to run anywhere fast enough. Yeah.
Are you paying attention to any of the news chutz la'aretz, outside of Israel? You're seeing what's happening around the world in terms of, both the pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian / anti-Israel protests that are taking place. What are the ways in which Israelis are processing the news of how this conflict is being perceived in other countries?
So on a very personal level, I mean, I've heard about the rally in Toronto, and a lot of people reach out to me and to my friends, and it is very supporting, and it's extremely helpful for us. Unfortunately, the official media here in Israel, the proper media, to my opinion, doesn't show it enough to say doesn't show it at all. But we do hear about, for example, the John Oliver case that happened this week, and all other kind of, I would even say, anti-Semitic actions, not even anti-Israel. And it's heartbreaking for us. The fact that, last week we talked about how I feel that we're getting supported by the Jewish community of abroad, and now I feel that it's kind of the other direction, that the state of Israel should support the Jewish community who lives outside of Israel.
One of the criticisms that we hear against Israel, which is coming from both those that are pro-Palestinian and some voices from the left of the Jewish community, which has to do with the imbalance of power. And people are looking at, let me say unequivocally, I think incorrectly, right? But people are looking at the unfortunate death toll which is higher for Palestinians than it is for Israelis, and saying that somehow or other that translates to the fact that Israel is somehow more responsible for the violence and its escalation than Hamas is, and that Israelis, don't really care about the lives of the Palestinians in Gaza that are suffering as a result of Hamas and its leadership. As an Israeli, what are your thoughts when you hear those kinds of arguments?
So first of all, I will say that in the Israeli media, at any newspaper, at every network, every time they mention the Israeli loss, they also mention the loss on the Palestinian side, whether if it's in Gaza or in the West Bank. And they always say how many children are part of this general number. And I mean, when you look at hard numbers, from my perspective, you have to remember the fact that we have the Iron Dome, it's an incredible concept. I hope I don't spoil anyone the Simpsons movie, but there's this part when they walk outside of their apartment and they realize that they're surrounded by this glass dome that is literally isolating them from the rest of the world. If we didn't have this defense system, I don't even want to imagine the numbers of loss that we would have here. And also, I think the question is, who do you target? I know, I mean, I can't really talk about what my siblings do in the army, but I hear from very firsthand that the Israeli army is not targeting civilians. And unfortunately, it's something that I cannot say about the missiles being shot from the Gaza Strip.
I'll emphasize that, that there's the moral distinction here is who's being targeted, and the Hamas is targeting civilians and civilian institutions and cities. And if it weren't for Iron Dome, the Israeli losses would be significantly higher. And I know that from every Israeli security analyst I've ever spoken to, that actually saves Palestinian lives. Because if Israel suffered greater losses, then Israel's response to Hamas would have to be less strategic than it is, and more forceful.
And another group of people that we need to remember is the fact that we also have Arabs who live in Israel. And a lot of the times the missiles are hitting those kinds of cities, of neighborhoods.
Yeah. I think the first Israeli death was an Arab 16-year-old, an Israeli Arab 16-year-old.
And even more than that, unfortunately, last night on one of the channels, there was a live reporter who said, we had a rocket falling in an Arab village. Unfortunately, no one was hurt. And he was fired less than 12 hours after that.
What are you hearing about potential ceasefires? Is there a sense in Israel that Israel's coming close to concluding what its goals are in this round of fighting, and that there'll be a ceasefire?
So the question about the goals is a question that is being asked, I think, at every television channel at the moment. No one wants to give the exact goal. There are some talking about ceasefire, but honestly, especially after the year that we've had with the COVID, I don't think anything is certain is up until the points that it's actually happening. We did have today, again, rockets being shot from Gaza towards Israel. And even just the smallest thing, I was driving my mother's car today because my car is still being taken care of.
Still being fixed.
Yeah. And I turned on the radio, and literally every minute and a half, the siren goes off and they say, well, if you live in this area in Beersheba, you have to run to your shelter. If you live in this area of Ashdod, you have to run to your shelter. So things are definitely not back to normal yet. The fact that we know how to work our lives around it in a way, it's just the reality that we have to deal with. But again, like practically, we don't really feel anything different today. So the talking about ceasefire, we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Until it happens, it's not happening.
Exactly.
Are people beginning to talk about what happens the day after? It seems like a lot of things have been exposed about Israeli society, Israeli policy issues, as well as relationship vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? Are people beginning to look beyond that, or is the current circumstances, enough for people to carry at this moment?
So I think at this point, we are still in the process. We don't have the perspective yet to say, well, this part has ended and now we need to look forward. I mean, we do have some local initiatives again about co-living and creating a dialogue, but it's nothing in a governmental scale. Let's put it like this.
Right. First, get through the immediate crisis and then think about long term.
Exactly. First, let's get a good night's sleep, and then we can think properly.
Amen. Amen. Anything else that you want to share with people in Toronto and other places around the world at this time?
I have to say that for people my age and younger than me, even a little older than me, we do live on social media, and we are part of this big dialogue, and we do get it very personal when anyone attacks Israel, and at the same time we do get it extremely personal when anyone defends us. So I would like to thank any part of the community or anyone else who hears us right now who's taking part of this dialogue, because honestly, just knowing that we're not alone means the world to us.
Well, I can tell you that certainly for us in Beth Tzedek, you're not alone personally. Israel's not alone collectively. We stand with Israel. We support Israel. And part of that is calling out mistakes that sometimes can be made, but you don't do that at a time in which Israel is facing a catastrophe like this. So for now, you should know that at Beth Tzedek, our custom has been, while Israel's under fire, we recite Tefillah L'Medina, L'Shalom every day, as well as one of the Shir L'Ma'alot, to keep Israel in our minds and to keep our prayers for peace and quiet and safety front and center. And that remains our prayer. I want to thank you, Ori, for taking the time again to talk with us. We'll do it again next week, and as long as Israel's under fire, and as long as you're able and safely able to do so, I think it's good for people to continue to have these personal accounts of what's happening. And I just want to say to anyone who's viewing that on Tuesday at 12:30, Yossi Klein Halevi from the Hartman Institute will be my guest for an hour-long conversation about Israel in this moment. Whereas Ori and her peers might not be able to think about what happens the next day, people like Yossi are always thinking about what happens the day after. And so we'll have a conversation with him about the state of current events regarding Israel. What's happening on the ground, what's happening politically, relationships with the diaspora, as well as Israeli, Jewish, Arab relations, and what happens the day after. So join us Tuesday at 12:30 for that. Information can be found on our website, www.beth-tzedek.org. Toda rabba v'hatzacha v'bitachon v'shalom.
Amen. Toda rabba.
Thank you, everyone.